Well, we're glad that those girls have been rescued or released, whichever way you want to put it. Moving forward now, as a military source reported that an unknown gunman killed 3 Burkina soldiers and 2 civilians. This latest attack shows the instability in Mali is spreading to its southern neighbor. Attacks by Islamist militants in Burkina Faso were rare before a major strike by Al-Qaeda-linked fighters in the capital, killing 29 people in January. Government sources say the latest attack prompted President Roch-Marc Kabore to delay a trip to Belgium and called an emergency ministerial meeting. The military source said that 3 soldiers were also wounded. Much earlier, the Defense Ministry explained that 2 of the attackers were dead in the attack at Ngangom, 5 kilometers from the Malian border. The military later released the dead were civilians. The same base was attacked in June, resulting in the death of 3 police officers. Still ahead on Network Africa. We're looking at more violence in the Central African Republic as a militant group attacks a refugee camp up north, killing 13. Welcome back to Network Africa. Fighters from Central African Republic's largest Muslim Seleka militia have attacked refugees in the country's remote north, killing 13 people before they were repelled by UN peacekeepers. Several people were wounded in the attack targeting Kaga Bandoro, a town of dirt roads and thatched mud houses. As some of the refugees fought back with sticks, but of course that was not enough. The attackers began firing with their guns, resulting in the casualties, after which hundreds of villagers panicked. Already, refugees from earlier violence then fled in the direction of the UN base. Thousands of people displaced from the latest flare-up of violence gather around the UN peacekeeping base, and a Catholic priest is helping them take refuge inside. The Central African Republic's UN peacekeeping mission, which is sought to try to keep rival factions from each other's throats, has not commented on the recent violence, but France, which is a former colonial power, says it's keeping its eye on the worsening security situation in the CAR, but it will still withdraw most of its troops by the end of the month. Before we look at other stories, the highlights of some of the things happening in the Central African Republic has been in chaos since 2013, when the Seleka, which draws mostly from the country's minority Muslim population, toppled then President Francois Bozize. The country, which holds reserves of uranium, gold and diamonds, is one of the world's most isolated economies, with exports and imports having to travel around 850 miles by road between the capital Bangui to the Cameroonian port of Douala. Pope Francis visited the capital at the end of last year to implore Christians and Muslims to end the spiral of hate. Legal practitioner Chukwemeka Eze is intrigued by developments in the CAR. He joins us now to talk about it. Thank you, Mr. Eze, for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. What do you make of the recent violence? It's been a while we heard about this sort of thing happening in the CAR.
What I make of it is that violence will continue in the Central African Republic until all the institutions in that country start functioning. As we speak today, the Seleka rebels and the anti-Balaka militia, they are still alive. We have about 14 groups, 14 violent groups, militant groups, militia groups fighting in the country. And you know the current president, Austin Achanges Touadera, is already in dialogue with about 11. But until the action of the country and the international community comes to a head, definitely I think the violence will continue, although in small measures. So the election and the outcome of the election, the fact that they have a new president will not stop the confusion in that country, especially the threat or the decision by France to remove these troops by the end of the month. That will worsen the situation, because France has been a stabilizing factor since the Seleka rebels took over from Francois Bozize in 2013. So if they leave now, I foresee more violence in the Central African Republic.
It's interesting you say that, Mr. Eze, because yes, France was one of the first responders to the violence in the CAR back in 2013, when the violence erupted between the Seleka rebels and the anti-Seleka militia. But France pulling out, you say, will have a more worsening impact on what's going on in the CAR. But France is only there to protect its own interests. So how does that make any difference?
It will be unfortunate for France to leave. I think the United Nations should do everything to sustain France in that country. You recall that France colonized the Central African Republic. They understand the internal shenanigans. They understand the politics of CAR. They were the people that sustained Jean Bede Bokassa when he was the emperor of that poor country. So they need not leave, because they have played a lot of roles, and the mineral resources of that country have gone to France for a very long time. They have to stay there and stabilize that country. If they leave, I foresee more violence. Although the International Contact Group for the Central African Republic will be meeting in November 17 in Brussels for a donor conference, but that may not be enough if you don't have sufficient force on the ground to respond to the threat of these 14 militia groups. So I think France has to remain in that country. If they leave, definitely there will be more problems in Central Africa.
Mr. Chukwuemeka is a legal practitioner. Thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa and keeping your eye on the rest of Africa. Egyptians can learn about recent history now by walking into the home of former President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Literally. Abdel Nasser was the country's second president, serving from 1956 until his death in 1970. He led the 1952 overthrow of the monarchy and introduced far-reaching land reforms the following year, but he is better known and loved for the nationalization of the Suez Canal and the political victory in the subsequent Suez crisis.
Abdel Nasser's home has been turned into a museum and is now open to the public. Before now, it had been used as an office for presidency employees until 2008. The country's culture ministry launched a competition in 2008 for architecture firms to transform the former president's residence into a museum. Out of all the entries, Karim Al-Shalbari's was chosen. In 2010, he began work on the project. The project has been in national demand since Nasser's death in 1970, according to the museum's manager, Ahmed Al-Shir.
Immediately after the passing of the leader in 1970, the Egyptian nation demanded a museum in honor of him. And so the best place to have a museum was the house he lived in. The house we are in currently was the home of the leader since 1952 until the day of his passing in 1970. But the rest of his family remained in the house, including his late wife, Tahir Kazim, who lived in the house until 1992. That's why it wasn't turned into a museum then.
The museum is divided into 3 different chambers. The first is a chamber of belongings, formerly used as a theatre during Nasser's time. It includes 15 glass cases showing various items used by Nasser during his rule. The second is a 2-story room named The People's Story. It includes Egypt's history from the coup on July 23, 1952, to Nasser's death on September the 28th, 1970. The chamber includes the media productions that were created to document the events of this period.
That's Network Africa. Thanks for watching. I am Amarachi Ubani.